Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Matthias Sterlich, and I'm the chair of the International Geraniaceae Group. And it is my absolute pleasure today to introduce Florent Grenier, who is known to many of us because of his intensive scholarship of the Pelargonium genus, but also of other genuses that flowers and other plants in Namaqualand and elsewhere in South Africa. He's done intensive studies on pollination, on insects, as well as on distribution of various species that are of interest to us. And he's going to talk to us about this particular topic today, although I'm sure he could focus on a lot more of interesting topics, and perhaps that's going to take place at some point in the future. Florent is still a PhD student at the University of Stellenbosch, although lately he has been making himself busy at his community farm. He also owns a nursery and, of course, is a well-known author of monographs, one of which is the recently published Secrets of Namaqualand Plants. That's a book that's known to many of us, and I understand that many of the photographs that we're going to see today are also from that book. But of course, we are all really looking forward to learning from Florent. So without further ado, Florent, I'd like to invite you to take us away.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for the introduction. We said we were leaving a discussion window open for anyone to tell us if there's anything wrong, like you can't hear us, or there's something that I'm saying that is hard to understand and I can easily re-explain. So yeah, feel free to use the discussion window, and we'll use that during the presentation. So I hope you can all hear me well. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today. So I called my talk, my presentation, Secrets of Namaqualand Pelargonium Species. And the link between how flowers look, how Pelagium flowers look, the link between that and the identity and the look of their pollinators. I'm just wondering, can you see my the little mouse on the screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I can show, okay, good. So here on the left, I put some photos of different Namaqualand, mostly Namaqualand Pelargonium species. I'll name them quickly, just for fun, because they are some of the very nice ones that I like a lot. That's the very scarce Pelaogonium fumarifolium. That's a new species actually that we will describe someday, which is related to Pelaogonium articulatum, which you can see here. That's Pelaogonium oblongatum. Then there's some Laperusias, which look very much like Pelaogoniums. Pelaogonium primosum, moniliforme, that's Vupotalense, that's Purculum, and that's Stipulaceum. And on the right, you can see some free insects. They are flies. They have very long tongues. They look very extraordinary. And we'll talk a little bit later about how important they are for pollinators, for Pelagoniums in Namaqualand, and actually even more than important, and you'll see why. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, I'm going to do a quick introduction of Namaqualand. I'll introduce you to the different landscapes of Namaqualand and also about the large succulent plant families that you find there, just as a way of introduction. So Namaqualand is that part of South Africa. So this map shows the western part of South Africa from Cape Town to over there. That's the Orange River over there. So that's the border to Namibia. Namaqualand is the top part of that region. So it's an area that's roughly 200 kilometers wide west from east and 400 kilometers high from south to north. So that's two different landscapes of Namaqualand. On the left is the very dry Richtersveld. It receives very, very little rain. It's only on the top of mountains like over there that you get a little bit of greenness. Otherwise, it's a very barren landscape. And on the right, you see the very famous daisy, annual daisy displays of Namaqualand, which, by the way, are very, very nice, but they are mostly a symptom of overgrazing because where you find them is where overgrazing has led to the disappearance of shrubs, and all that grows is basically the disturbance-loving annual daisies. And a lot of tourists come to see those massive, beautiful displays every year. So, yeah, and a lot of Pelargoniums in Namaqualand. On the left is the beautiful Pelaogonium pulchillum, and on the right is one of its pollinators, long-tongued fly from the horsefly family, which are well known for sucking blood from mammals, but they are also feeding on flowers, actually. But we'll talk about that a bit later. First, I'll show you a bit of the diversity of Namaqualand Pelargoniums sorted by growth shape. I think one of the main growth shape of Namaqualand Pelargoniums is geophytic species. So they are plants which are growing out of a very thick taproot, which is buried in the soil and doesn't form any long stems, only very short stems and short leaves, which are laying out on the ground. So here is Pelagium incrassatum, which is a very common species throughout Namaqualand. And on the right is its flowers, which flowers at the end of winter around September. The other growth shape type of Pelargonium is the stem succulents, which are also called pachycolous plants. So on the left, you get the beautiful Pelargonium cryptmifolium with very, very thick stems. And on the right is a form of it's a probably Pelargonium ferulaceum from the southern Richtersveld. So that's stem succulents. Then you get the shrubs. On the left here is one of my favorite scents of Namaqualand. It's Pelaogonium Spinosum. What's amazing about it is that it flowers in November when everything's dry, and also it's in the Richtersveld, so it's a place that's bare. So you get those white flowers when everything's dry. So it's pretty amazing, and the scent of the flowers are scented, like it's very spicy and sweet smell. And on the right is Pelaogonium primosum, which makes beautiful displays also in Namaqualand at the start of, well, in the midst of spring actually, and start of summer. That's a view, beautiful view in the Richtersveld with a very huge shrub of Pelaogonium primosum. And finally, last type of growth shape in Namaqualand is the annuals. So on the left, you have Pelaogonium senesioides, probably. It's an annual Pelaogonium. And on the right, it's the minute Pelaogonium minimum. It only has a few minute leaves, and the flowers are less than a centimeter wide. Now I'll show you quickly the different large families of succulents in Namaqualand, just as a way of a very, very short introduction, so you can see how diverse the flora is there. But and then we'll just get back to the main topic, which is Pelagian flowers. So very quickly, I'm going to go from the largest family to the smallest of succulents, and so here is the largest family is the Aesoaceae, well known for the stone plants. On the right is Lithops, on the left is Conophyton. That's other Isoaceae with Chiropsis here. Then the second largest family is Crassulaceae, with Crassula genus, Adromescus, Tylecodon, that's one of the smallest ones, and Cotyledon. Then you have the Asphodelaceae with the very well-known aloes. That's one of the largest aloe species of all, Alopulanceae. It's huge, also very old. Then you have Bulbini and Trachyandra with the amazing spiral leaves. Well, not spiral, but and then Apocynaceae with the emblematic half-men, Pachypodium, and Hoodia. Euphorbiaceae. I'm just going quickly through them. Asteraceae, which is the family where you get all the daisies, but you also get succulents like Ophona on the left, and Caputia, which used to be Senecio, on the right. Anacampserotaceae with Anacampseros avonia. Dioscoriaceae, so it's the elephant foot. And then you get all the bulbs and geophytic plants, so a bit more similar to Pelaogonium, so the Iridaceae with Gladiolus and La Perusia, Asparagaceae with Lacinalia and Ornithogalum, Ameridaceae with those weird-looking Getilis and Brunsvigia. There's also orchids if you go to the wet places of the Namaqualand. And funny-looking Oxalis, which is a genus that's widespread throughout the world, but you get some of the highest diversity in South Africa. Colchicaceae and Hypoxidaceae. And so that's finished for the overlook of the Namaqualand flora. I'll introduce you to the 3 different vegetation types. There's the succulent karoo, the rhinoceros and feinboss. There are 3 very distinct vegetation types. Doesn't look so much like that on the photos, but each vegetation type has its own flora, has its own communities of plant species, and there's very few species that grow in different vegetation types. So succulent karoo on the left is the driest vegetation type. It's got a lot of succulents and it doesn't burn naturally. So in the middle you have the rhinoceros felt. It's a vegetation type that burns regularly. And it's got a lot of geophytic Pelaogoniums that you find in the wettest place of Namaqualand, high up in the mountains. And if you go very, very high on the highest peaks of Namaqualand, you get feinboss, which is mostly a vegetation type, which is mostly known from the Cape area, but you find it on the highest mountains of Namaqualand as well. But you've got to climb, and that is another vegetation type which is meant to burn for vegetation to recover and to remain rich and diverse. But it's not very widespread in Namaqualand, only in small pockets. And I'll finish this Namaqualand presentation, the overview, by showing you the 4 main landscapes of Namaqualand. So down in the south, you have the Kneesvlakte, which is basically the largest area in the world that is covered by quartz pebbles. And the main reason is that I think up until 8 million years ago, the Orange River, which is flowing up north now at the border of Namibia over there, used to flow through the Kneesvlakte. So the estuary of the river was much further south than today. And it's the river that brought all the pebbles in the Kneesvlakte, and which makes it such a unique landscape. Then if you go a bit further north, you get the Arteveld. It's a place where you have all those granite domes. I love that one because this looks like a pig's head. Usually the granite domes are very steep, very difficult to climb. Look at that one at the bottom there. very dangerous. There's quite a lot of Pelagium diversity in that kind of landscape. Then if you go towards the sea, towards the coastal plains, you have the Sandveld. It's mostly sandy habitats, and it is actually, it's not the place where you get most Pelagiums, but you get some very interesting ones still. And the northernmost part of Namaqualand is the Richtersveld. It's one of my favorites. I've spent a lot of time climbing all those mountains, and the geology and the vegetation types are very, very diverse depending whether you are on that type of rock or that type of slope or aspect of a mountain. And I think it's known as the most diverse desert or rock desert or something, mountain desert in the world for plant diversity. And that's two views of the Richtersveld. On the right is the very, very dry northeastern parts, and on the left is the highest ridges of the Stinkfontainberg, which is one of the highest ridge of the Richtersveld, where you get a bit of greenness. So finally, one of the characteristics of Namaqualand is that it's very dry throughout spring, summer, and autumn, and most of the rain falls in winter. So that's a view of summer, and now I'll show you a view of the same place in winter. It's much greener. So most plants grow in winter when the rains fall, when the ground is wet. So they are adapted to grow when the temperatures are rather low and when there is a little light, actually. That's one specificity of Namaqualand. All the areas east of Namaqualand in South Africa are mostly summer rainfall or autumn and spring rainfall. So it's mostly the western parts of South Africa, Namaqualand, and the Cape areas that are winter rainfall. That's again a daisy carpet, which are blooming in August and September, so in the midst of winter. So now let's get back to the main topic, which is what's the link between the look of flowers in Namaqualand, so that's a bunch of Namaqualand flowers, and the identity and the look of their pollinators. So on the right, I put a bunch of Namaqualand pollinators. There's a long-tongue fly, there's another one, we'll talk about it later. There's also beetles that are pollinating flowers, also birds. There's flies, bees, also rodents, and other things. So just to make it clear, pollination is a part of a very important part of plant reproduction. It's basically the transport of pollen to the female part of the flower, which is the stigma, and which enables the fecundation of the ovules and the formation of a fruit full of seeds. So pollination can be made by wind, but it can also be made by insects or other animals, and it can also be made by the flower on its own. So it's called self-pollination. In Namaqualand, the most pollinators are from the insect world, and what's interesting is that inside the insects, there's a huge diversity of fly pollinators and less bee pollinators if you compare to the northern hemisphere or like Europe, where you get a lot of bees and a lot of butterflies and fewer flies, sorry. In South Africa, you get a lot of flies and fewer butterflies and fewer bees. Yeah, and on the left, so there's a bunch of photo of flowers, but I'm not going to name them all. It's just here, I want to show you a nice Pelaogonium rubiginosum with the beautiful red lines on all petals. So now I'm going to talk to you about pollination syndrome, and I'm going to explain now what it's all about, pollination syndromes. And we're going to start with an easy example of Pelaogonium fulgidum, which grows on the west coast, mostly throughout Namaqualand. So let's look at the characteristics of those flowers. So the first thing you can see is it's very red, orangish, very bright. It's got long tubes, like 2 or 3 centimeters long, and the nectar, which is the reward for pollinators, is at the bottom of those tubes. It's very abundant and sugary. And the last thing you can notice is that the tube is quite wide at its in its upper parts and slightly curved. And that enables just one type of pollinator to reach the nectar, and it is the sunbird. I think it's called malachite sunbird. And it's very, very specific pollinators which mostly feeds on the nectar of flowers. And in the case of Pelaogonium fulgidum, the main pollinator is that bird because it's the only animal that can reach the nectar from the top, from the entrance of the flower down to the bottom of the tube. So yeah, so it's a very exclusive relationship here between that plant and its pollinator. Now let's have a look at different plant species, which is not a Pelaogonium, it's Babiana ringens from the same area, coastal areas of South Africa. So if you compare to Pelaogonium fulgidum, you can see a lot of similar characteristics. It's got the same color, it's got that same wide tube, curved, a lot of sugary nectar at the bottom of it. And it's also got that funny long perch, which looks like something a bird would stand on. And it's actually the case. So here you have a Babiana plant that relies on the same pollinator as Pelaogonium fulgidum, and that's got very similar flower characteristics. And the perch, it was actually studied by scientists from Stellenbosch and Cape Town, and they found that it was actually adapted to be used as a perch by the pollinators and pretty much for nothing else. So it's a pretty crazy example of adaptation to pollinators. It's basically an inflorescence, so a flower stick that lost its flowers and became a hard perch. So a very interesting evolution story. So, and let's look at one last. So there was a question about fulgidum, asking whether it's also self-pollinated. Well, there's quite a number of plants that both self-pollinate and that rely on pollinators. Self-pollination is mostly like I don't know how you say it, but is a way to deal with the absence of pollinators some years. So it's always good to have a bit of self-pollination. Some plants can't, some can. It's always better to be pollinated by pollinators as they will move pollen further to other plants, while self-pollination can lead to problems of inbreeding because yeah, no, I'm not going to explain that inbreeding can be a problem that arises through self-pollination. But anyway, so that's, and here I put a third photo of flowers of Tylecodon paniculata, which are also similar color, long tubes and lots of nectar. So it's also pollinated by sunbirds, but not just actually. I think there's a few bees that can feed into it. So it's not as clear, but what I wanted to show here is 3 plant species that have got very similar flowers and pollinated by just one or a few similar pollinators that we call pollination syndrome. So when you have similar flower characteristics that appear in evolutionary distant plant families, it's an evolutionary convergence. So I'll explain here. You have Babiana, it's an Aridaceae, that's a Pelaogonium, different family, and Tylecodon, different family. They evolved similar flower traits in response to just the same natural selection pressure, which is the need to be pollinated by the songbirds. So that's evolutionary convergence, and it's a very strong signal of natural selection by pollinators. So those three flower plant species share the same pollination syndrome. It's good to remember that term, pollination syndrome, because I'll show you now some other pollination syndromes. So let's move to another example which involves some Pelaogoniums and which I find fascinating. So let's look at those four plant species. There's three Pelaogoniums, Namaqualand, which is in the Richtersveld, Triphyllum, which is more in the Cederberg, and Tricolor, which is mostly in the Klein Karoo, and Gaultheria diffusa, which is very, very different from the Asteraceae, the Daisy family. So what do they have in common? Well, it looks like they've got funny dark bumps on the petals, which are also very shiny. You can see it's very shiny surface on Tricolor, very, very shiny on Gaultheria, and here on Namaqualand. And it's funny how the petal shape has changed so that it looks like a bumpy, something bumpy. Turns out, so that this suggests like the resemblance between flower characteristics between those different species. And I must say that those three different Pelaogoniums, they belong to three different subgenera, I think. So they are not related, and they evolved similar flower characteristics. So that suggests that might be a different pollination syndrome if it turns out that they are only pollinated by one specific pollinator, and it is the case. So here it is, and it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fly. It's actually a bee fly from the Bumbleweed family. It's only 2 or 3 millimeters long, so it can barely be seen. And how pollination works on those different species, it's mostly been studied in Gaultheria diffusa, but it's now starting to be studied in other species, is that that little fly is tricked into thinking that those bumps are mates, so that they are females resting on the flowers. So the males of that fly species are attracted to the flowers and actually trying to mate with those dark bumps. And while doing so, they are loading on lots of pollen, and as they move between flowers, they will pollinate them. So it's actually a pollination strategy that is called sexual deception. Sexual deception, as it deceives pollinators into thinking that part of the flower is actually a mate. It's very well known in orchids, actually. Very interesting. So turns out this is another pollination syndrome, or things like it. Seems very likely. So we call it the Megaparpus capensis pollination syndrome here. And now we'll see other examples. That's a Pelaogonium, a geophytic one from the Polyactium subgenus, I guess. I haven't identified it. It's difficult, and those are not the ones I'm mostly interested about. But so here, the flower characteristics, it's got light petals, light-colored petals, long tubes again. So you see the long tubes up to 4 centimeters long. The nectar is still down there at the bottom, so the pollinators must have some very long tongue to get down there to drink the nectar. And the last characteristics, which is the most important here, is that it is scented, sweet scented, and mostly at dusk or in the night. So that suggests that it's a night pollinator that is visiting this flower. Now, if you look at that Laperusia pyramidalis, it's got very similar traits. It's got white petals, long tubes, lots of nectar at the bottom of them, and that sweet smell. So here, suggests those similarities suggest that they share a similar pollinator, and turns out it is the case. It's moth pollinated, so it's a moth pollination syndrome. It's not studied so much because moths are very difficult to observe, so there's still a lot of work to do in that area. I'll just show you, so moving from one pollination syndrome to the next, I'll show you one that is not involving Pelaogoniums, but it's very interesting also and very striking to understand pollination syndromes. And it's Staphylia from the Asclepiad family, or Apocynaceae now. It's got stinky flowers and flesh-colored petals and hairs that look like rotting and fungi, basically, and they are indeed pollinated by flies, which are tricked into thinking that it's a rotting animal and that they must lay eggs in it. And while doing so, they are pollinating. So it's another case of deception by flowers. And I forgot the name that it has, but yeah, another example. So we're moving to yet another pollination syndrome, because that's just something very remarkable about South Africa, is that it's got rodents that pollinate, and I think there's very, very, very few other places in the world where rodents are such important pollinators. So here in the middle, you have Masonia depressa. It's got flowers laying on the ground, and the flowers are yeasty. They've got a yeasty scent, very strong, and there's a lot of nectar, and it's very sweet. And that is all that those small rodents need. I think that rodent is the elephant shrew, and that's what they feed on at night. So now, so now if you look at other plants of the Masonia genus, you get other species that have got the same types of flowers. So I'm just showing a few of them. And now inside the Protea family, which is a different family again, you've got a few species that have got flowers laying very low to the ground and with still that yeasty smell and lots of sugar in the nectar. And that suggests, and it's indeed the case, that they share the pollination syndrome of being pollinated uniquely by rodents. So a very interesting case of evolutionary convergence between two different plant families, the Asparagaceae here on the left and the Proteaceae on the right. Okay, so I've shown you a lot of pollination syndromes within species of Namaqualand plants. And now we'll move to another subject before going back to the pollination syndrome stories. But now I've got to explain to you what coevolution is, so that we understand the last examples of pollination syndromes that we're going to talk about, which are the main topic of my PhD, which are the long-tongued flies that you can see here on this slide. But let's see what coevolution is, taking the example of long-tongued flies and the Pelaogonium species which they pollinate. So here, let's look at on the right. So there's a fly. It's roughly 2 centimeters long. It's pretty big for a fly, and it's got a tongue 3 to 4 centimeters long. This fly feeds on just one thing, on nectar, and it actually feeds on the nectar of flowers with very long tubes. So here you see a Laperusia dolomitica, which has tubes just as long as the tongue of the fly. So the fly can reach the nectar at the bottom of the tube, and that's basically all it feeds on. And while feeding on the flowers, it loads pollen. You can see all the pollen on its face and on its back. It loads pollen on its body, and it pollinates very, very effectively. So that's the long-tongued flies of Namaqualand. Now we can wonder, like, how come they've evolved such long tongues, and how come the flowers have also evolved such long tubes? That's what we'll see now. And this is the mechanism of coevolution. So what's happening? So we're going to use that drawing from Goldblatt and Manning from a very important article in 1996. So it shows a fly that is feeding inside the flower. So its tongue is inserted inside the tube. It's drinking nectar from the bottom of it. And while doing so, it's loading pollen on its belly. Okay, so the first thing here is that the fly drinks more nectar if her tongue is as long or longer than the flower tubes. So that makes sense. If its tongue is longer than the flower tubes, its tongue is going to reach the bottom of it, and it's going to be able to drink all of the nectar inside the flower. So that means there's natural selection. There's selective pressure for the tongue of the pollinators to increase over time. So basically, I haven't explained what natural selection is, but if you have a fly population with different tongue length, it means here that the flies with the longest tongues, or the tongues that actually exceed the length of the tubes of the flowers that they visit, it's those flies with the longest tongues that are gonna feed best on the flowers, and thus that over time they are gonna be able to drink more nectar, and it's also linked to reproduction. So they're gonna be able to breed more, and they're gonna be advantaged within their population. So there's gonna be, over different generations of flies, there's gonna be evolution towards flies that have got longest tongues. Okay, and now the second thing that we can see here on the plant side. So now we're just on the fly side, but on the plant side, the plant is better pollinated if her flower nectar tubes are longer than the fly's tongue. And that's not as easy to understand, but basically, when the tube is longer than the tongue of the fly, then the fly has got to push its head very hard against the bottom of the petals. It's going to push to get as much nectar as it can. So it's going to rub a lot on the pollen, a lot more than if the tongue was just too long, and then it would be just hovering around. So if it's got a short tongue, then it's gonna load more pollen, so it's gonna be more effective for plant reproduction. So here we have natural selection. We have a selective pressure for nectar tubes to get longer. So within a plant population, the flowers with the longest tubes will be pollinated better, they will export and receive more pollen. So now you see something funny is that the tongue must increase in length, and the tubes must increase in length over time through natural selection. So this goes on, and it's called co-evolution. And that's the main idea how such things can arise in nature. And it's something that Darwin actually studied in Madagascar like 150 years ago. And now it's being found in a lot of different pollination systems. But now you can wonder, until when? I mean, until when is it going to increase in size? And at some point it's got to stop. And maybe it's stopped today. Well, as you can see, flying around with a long tongue can become a difficulty. So it's thought that at some point this coevolution is going to decrease in speed, and it's going to stop because there is maneuverability problems for the fly to have such a long tongue. So there's so that's the idea. So I'm just showing another example of coevolution. So it's also flowers with long tubes, but now one flower has got two different nectar tubes. It's actually not nectar inside those tubes, it's oil. It's an oil that is collected by bees. So now if you can just guess how the pollinator looks like. So if you compare it to that system with the long tongue flies, here it's got to be something with very long appendices, but it's actually not tongues, it's actually not long tongues, it's long legs. So it's actually a bee that's got two very long front legs, and that uses them, one leg in each tube, to collect oils for the feeding. I think it's for the feeding of the larvae, but I'm not sure. That's another example that's been studied as a good example of coevolutions between flower tube length and the length of some insect organs. So now that we've seen that story about coevolution with long-tongue flies, we'll get back to looking at another pollination syndrome, which is what I've studied for my PhD. And yeah, so that pollination syndrome, we call it the purple pollination syndrome, but I'll explain now what it's all about. So first, let's just have a look at those three flowers. So on the left is La Perusia dolomitica. In the middle is Acanthopsis. And on the right is the beautiful Pelaogonium echinatum. So again, let's have a look at what they share in terms of flower characteristics. So here the flowers are pretty purple, magenta. They've got long tubes, very long tubes. Here also in the center, you can't see the bottom of the tube, but it's also very long, like 4 centimeters long. And the other thing that's very interesting is that you see around the entrance of the tube, there's little arrows, almost like it's called Nectar Guides, but there's little things that look like feathers sometimes, like here a bit, or like arrows. Here you've got those lines. These are called Nectar Guides, and they were studied in some species, and it was found that they are actually indicating the center of the flower to pollinators. So it's helping them to aim for the center of the flower and to insert their tongue at the right place to get the nectar. But anyway, so here I wanted to show these 3 species because they share flower characteristics. So again, we can maybe they are part of the same pollination syndrome, or they share a same pollination syndrome, and they have just one or a few pollinators. So let's just look a bit further. Here I put photos of more species, and they all share the same, again, the same floral characteristics as the 3 that I've shown before. So there's plants from the Iridaceae family, with La Perusias, Romulea, Tritonia, Babiana down there at the bottom. That's, I forgot, Quesorhiza. Then there's 3 Pelaogonium species. I haven't shown all of them, but there's a Pelaogonium echinatum, Pelaogonium cericifolium in the middle, and Pelaogonium incrassatum. And here again on the right, you get our Acanthopsis. So all these flowers look similar. And that's how I started to, I'll answer the question just now. That's how I started to my PhD studies in 2015. Is I wanted to have a look at what was the pollinator of all those flowers, expecting that it was just one pollinator, and that's what actually had been published previously, but I just wanted to make sure. So in total, I found 42 species in Namaqualand from 3 different plant families and more than 8 plant genera that have rather similar flowers and flowering times. So the question is it all evolutionary convergence? Did they evolve to be pollinated just by the same pollinator? And turned out that yes, but not just one pollinator. So down there, the long-tongue fly at the bottom is called Prozica peringii. That was reported as the main pollinator of all those flowers previously. But it turned out, as I went to study those flies in Namaqualand, that there was another fly that looks very similar, the one at the top. I'm not going to explain to you how we found out that they are different species, but they turned out to be, and it was also checked with their DNA. But there's another fly that looks so much like the same, but is also pollinating all those flowers. and they are the only two pollinators of all those 42 different species. So it's a very, very striking example of a pollination guild. So I haven't explained what guild means. So it's a guild will be a group of species that share a pollination syndrome, basically. A group of species that have similar flowers and just one or a few pollinators that are very similar. So here we call that all those flowers, those 42, the purple pollination guild. And just now for fun, just a fun fact, side question about that pollination system. So so in Namaqualand, the flies, they visit flowers of different co-occurring plant species. So if you go to just one hill or one mountain, you'll find like a few of those species co-occurring and being pollinated by those two flies. So the question is, how does pollen reach the right species when one fly species visits flowers from different co-occurring plants? So how does it not get messed, and how does pollen not reach other plant species, and then it would be lost and it would be wasted? And the answer is very interesting. On the right is again the same drawing from the Goldblatt and Manning article in 1996, and it shows that there's 4 species here, the 4 flowers. The bottom is Incrostatum. Then there's 2 Laperusias. I think there's Silenoides and another one, maybe Levisiana. And at the top is Babiana dredgei. And turns out that each flower has got stamens. So what is actually holding the pollen? It's got stamens that are shaped differently, or that have got different length, so that the pollen is going to be deposited at different parts of the body of the fly. And this way, the body of the fly is partitioned, so that it delivers pollen just to the right species. So each part of the body is meant to be used as the transport place for the pollen of just one specific plant. So here at the bottom, a Pelagium incrustatum puts pollen on the belly. Then that Laperusia puts pollen more like on the head. And then Laperusia silenoides puts pollen on the back of the head and top of the thorax. And on the top, Babiana puts pollen in the back of the fly. So it's partitioning the fly body so that pollen is not wasted, which is a very, very interesting strategy. So now, okay, so we've talked about the purple pollination guild. It's all flowering in August and September in Namaqualand. Wherever you go to Namaqualand, you'll see those flowers. You'll mostly see Laperusia silenoides and Pelaogonium incrustatum and some Cericifolium just in one specific area. The others are more scarce, but you will see them everywhere. So you will see the flies if you look carefully. So that's the purple pollination guild. Now, my first year, 2015, I just stayed out in the field as those flowers started to go down, to disappear as it was getting drier. So in September, it's the last rains, then it gets dry and everything goes dormant except this. After the purple guild is over, comes a new mystery. So when things get dry, you get a bunch of mostly Pelaogoniums now, but also some Laperusias that are starting to flower. And they all flower at the same time, mostly from October, November, some to December, but mostly October, November. It's very striking how much they look alike. Again, same story. So to me, that was a mystery, and I'll explain why. Because, so I'll just name those plants because I think it's interesting. Pelaogonium frumarifolium. That's an undescribed one related to articulatum. I think I named them at the beginning of the talk. So, but anyway, so there's 3 Laperusias here. That's Anceps. That's Verecunda, and that's Fabrici. So now, why is it a mystery? So that's the blue line is more or less the distribution area of all those flowers. In total, there's over 150 plant species. It's huge, but most of them are actually down there towards the Cape. But they all have whitish flowers. They've got long nectar tubes and nectar guides, so those lines that are looking like feathers, they all have them. And they flower from October to December, and they have no scent. So that all suggests that it is pollinated by some long-tongue fly. But now the mystery was because we only knew long-tongue flies in that whole area from very, very specific restricted areas. So first, down there in brown was the area where you find Megistorhynchus longirostris. It's a long-tongue fly. It's actually the one with the longest tongue. It's crazy. And one individual was caught with a 10-centimeter long tongue. So it's the craziest long-tongue fly of South Africa. But it was only known from the Cape Flats and some of the coastal areas, only from there. And then there's two horseflies called Phyllolaiki gulosa and Phyllolaiki rostrata. Again, horseflies, they are from it's the horsefly family. So it's the ones that, bite humans and horses and other animals. But they also feed on flowers, well, some of them. And these two, they do feed on flowers. And they do pollinate some of those flowers, the white flowers, but they are only found on the very high peaks of the Cederberg. I only put a very small area here, but you also find them on the top of the Kamisberg, a little bit in the Richtersvaart, but in very, very restricted areas. So it doesn't cover the whole range of those 150 plant species that all share the same pollination syndrome. So there was a big mystery. I knew there was something weird about that either those free pollinators were more had a wider distribution than thought, or that there was some other pollinator that wasn't known and that was out there pollinating all those flowers. So I did a lot of field work, and I lost like a month looking for the pollinator, expecting to find something big, like those big horseflies. So these are so huge, when they fly around, you'll hear them. The one down there, Rostrata, the body is 3 centimeters long, and you can see here the tongue is 6 centimeters long. So the whole fly is almost, with the wings, almost 10 centimeters long. So it's a very impressive fly. It's very loud. You'll hear them. So I was looking for something like that, or something from that family with very big flies. And it turned out that it wasn't what I should have been looking for, because after a month, I started to look at bee flies. So the bee flies from the Bombelid family. I knew they were around, but when they fly around, they've got just quite a short tongue, so I wasn't too much interested into them. And also, there had never been a long-tongue fly reported from the bee fly family. So I thought it's not worth it. And also, those flies, they were so difficult to catch. I didn't know how to catch them. I had so much difficulty, but after a month, I was so much in despair of finding the mysterious pollinator that I caught one. And actually, I pulled on at the end of its tongue here, and it turned out that it had a tongue 3.5 times longer than this. So it unfolds 3.5 times when it goes near flowers. So here you see one that is actually unfolding its tongue as it goes near a flower. It's not even unfolded to its maximal extent. It's just starting to unfold. So it's very impressive. And they are very shy. So that's basically how I never noticed them before. And once I started noticing them, I was finding them everywhere. Turned out they are distributed throughout that whole area. And it's the main pollinator of many of those plant species. Mostly in the dry areas, not so much down in the Cape, but mostly in the northern dry areas. So that was the mystery resolved, and then I went back to all the mountains where I missed it, and then it was everywhere. So it just shows that sometimes you just remove some possibilities from when you're looking for something, just expecting it's not worth looking there, and actually ended up being worth looking there. So it's actually funny. It's the same as when looking for plant species. There's areas that look so awful. You think there will never be anything interesting, and actually there is. And some recent new plant species findings actually ended up being in really ugly areas that I would have never visited. But anyway, so that's the story of the white guild mystery. So it's just a word of caution, because for now I've only shown flowers that are highly specialized towards one or a few pollinators, but there's many flowers that are not specialized. They are called generalist flowers. That means they are actually open to being pollinated by lots of different insects or animals. And so it's the case of that Ornithogalum. It's got nectar that is reachable by bees, by flies, by butterflies, by lots of things. And on the right is Orphona, also pollinated by quite a range of pollinators. So not all flowers are highly specialized to interact with just one or a few pollinator species. So you can't always use the pollination syndrome story. And also another funny story is that pollinators also make exceptions. So here you've got long-tongue flies that are so desperate in the drought of 2017. So it was so dry, there was nothing flowering. So all the flies that came out, they went visiting actually generalist short-tubed flowers to just survive. On the right is Salvia. It's the sage family. It's actually mostly pollinated by bees, and that big horseflies is visiting it. You can see that it's not even touching the stigma or any of the reproductive parts. So it's actually it's probably stealing nectar more than anything else, more than pollinating. But anyway, it's just to show that the specialized pollinators also sometimes make exceptions. And another funny story about flower characteristics is that for now I've shown you how flower characteristics are aimed to attract pollinators, but some actually are more meant to repel unwanted pollinators, because pollinators basically they don't care much about plant reproduction. They mostly feed on flowers. So some of them are actually going to act more as thieves. They're going to drink nectar without pollinating, just like this horsefly now is. And some are just going to be inefficient. Like bees, for example, they actually eat a lot of pollen, or they collect it for their young. So they are not as efficient. They're going to waste a lot of pollen. And I'll show you an example now. It's an aloe, and then I'll show you Pelaogonium. But the aloe, this aloe, its effective pollinator is a bird. But it's got a lot of inefficient pollinators that might steal the nectar. So it produces a bitter nectar to repel inefficient pollinators such as bees and sunbirds. So this way it's only visited by the effective bird species. And here it's more like, it's never been studied much, but it's just a question that I have is Pelagium rapacium. The lower petals, they are joined against each other so that the stamens and the pollen is hidden inside it. So it's got fused lower petals, so the pollen remains hidden. And the question is it a way to prevent pollen theft by bees? Because bees would collect pollen without being very efficient. This flower is actually pollinated by very large horseflies, so the same long-tongue flies that I've shown you before. And the horseflies, when they drink nectar, they just lay on those lower petals and they open because their body is very heavy, and then the pollen goes on the horsefly body. But perhaps hiding the pollen is a way to not attract bees, and so it repels some unwanted visitors. So it's just an idea, it's never been studied. And that's just to show an interesting photo of a monkey beetle, which are beetles that are mostly eating pollen, specialized on eating pollen on a flower of Pelagium primosum. So you can see how much damage some insects can do to plant reproduction. So sometimes that's why they evolve ways of hiding it or trying to repel those pollen eating insects. I don't know how much time I have left. I've gone almost 45 minutes now. So there's just a last few things. I don't know if I've got time to keep going or.
Go ahead, of course, Florent.
Okay, it's going to be I'm going to try to do it quite short. Okay, so I wanted to talk about speciation. So the concept is a bit difficult to explain, so I hope it goes fine. But so first we look on the left here. Speciation is when one common ancestor species over time, over evolutionary time, it can be 1,000 years or 1 million years, as one species actually becomes two species. That's the process through which diversification of species happens, basically. But to understand speciation, you must understand what species are. And here I'll use the biological concept of species. I'm not going to talk about the other ones, but we're mostly interested about the biological concept here. And the biological concept of species is based on the idea of reproductive isolation. So I'll give the definition now. Under that concept, a species is a set of organisms which can be distributed into different populations, but it's a set of organisms that can breed between each other and lead to fertile offspring, and which cannot breed with organisms of different species, basically. So they can breed between each other. Someone is asking if the sound is gone.
I can hear you well, Florent.
Okay, okay. So I'll keep going. Okay, so a species is a set of individuals which breed between each other and cannot breed with the others. It doesn't always work with plants because plants sometimes interbreed with other species, and sometimes the hybrids are fertile, so sometimes they're not. So there's no species concept that can work for all the organisms on Earth, but let's use that definition here. So what brings what makes species what keeps species apart from each other is reproductive isolation. And there's two types of reproductive isolation between species. There's post-pollination isolation. So what arises after pollination, it can be genetic incompatibility. So that's when you try to cross two species and it doesn't work, it doesn't make a fruit. So they are genetically incompatible, even if you have a pollinator that goes between the flowers of those two species. And you can also have non-viable offspring. It's actually something I saw in the Namaqualand. There was I'm pretty sure, a hybrid between Pelaogonium sericifolium and Pelaogonium procellum. And I tried to pollinate that Pelaogonium and it never worked. So that is, I think, one case of non-viable offspring. And the other type of reproductive isolation between species is pre-pollination isolation. It can be flowering time. So if you've got two species that flower at different times, obviously there's never going to be a pollinator that moves pollen from one to the next. If the pollinators are different, same thing, there's never going to be pollen flow between the two species. And when pollen is placed at different places, it's placed on different spots on the pollinator, it can also lead to isolation between two species. So it's a lot of concepts. I'll just give an example. So these, and it's not the best example you'll see, because, well, it's a good example, but that means there's some taxonomical things to change to me. So on the left is Pelaogonium primosum subspecies Speciosum. And on the right is Pelagium primosum, subspecies primosum. They look very similar. The leaves, the shrub, they're pretty similar. But the flowers, they're different in different ways. They differ in different ways. Mostly, the one on the left has got short tubes. It's also got those lower petals that are a bit different, short, very short. But mostly, it's the color of the upper petals, much darker, and the short tubes, which is actually associated here with pollination by bees and moths, if I remember well. But on the right, it's definitely a flower that's pollinated by long-tongue flies. It's got a very long tube. It's got those beautiful, well, it's more whitish flowers. So the long-tongue flies, they're not attracted to Speciosum on the left. They're attracted to primosum. So they've got two different bunch of pollinators, those two subspecies. So if you consider the biological species concept, they've got no ways of hybridizing, having different pollinators, and never found any hybrids between them, even if they co-occur at different parts of the Richteswert. Also, they flower at slightly different times. So the one on the left flowers in September, early September, and the one on the right starts more like end of September until November. So due to all those reasons, to me, they should be different species. There's no pollen flow between those two, and they co-occur without hybridizing. Now, let's go back to that slide and have a look at another example. So we look here on the left. We have Pelagium incrustatum and Pelagium greenvillae. And now you understand why I talked about why it was important to talk about the purple Pollination Guild, because Pelagium incrustatum is part of it, and the white Pollination Guild, so the mystery one, because that Pelagium greenvillae is also part of it. So those two species, they are sister species. Turns out that the DNA data shows that they are sister species, which means that they evolved most recently from a common ancestor. They are very, very evolutionarily close to each other. And the main thing that separates them is pollination syndrome, one having more like pinkish, darkish flower, and the other one having white flowers. And the one on the left flowers in August, September, just like any other species of the purple Pollination Guild, and the one on the right flowers later, like all the other species of the white Pollination Guild. So, and because of that, they are different species because they have different pollinators and different flowering times. So the question, what we can wonder is, was speciation induced by pollinators? Is it the adaptation of those two species to a different set of pollinators, which induced reproductive isolation between those two, and induced the separation of those two species? That we cannot tell without doing a lot more studies on lots of other things. But that's it's likely, but we cannot tell for sure. What is for sure is that there's a lot of examples like this. And I'll show you this one, which is not Pelaogonium, it's Babiana, but there's lots of examples like this, where you get two species that are sister species, very close evolutionarily, and they just differ in the Pollination Guild. So here, Babiana dredgei is purple Pollination Guild, and La Perusia is white Pollination Guild, again, flowers a bit later. So again, it's exactly the same example as this one. It's basically the same thing. The leaves are very similar. The plants are just the same except for the pollination syndrome. So again, we can wonder to what extent pollinators induced speciation in between those two species. That's just another example. Two La Perusias, they are sister species, and they just differ again. One being the purple guild, and the one here being the white guild. And there's other examples. I'm not going to show them all, but I'm going to finish by one of the great surprises that I had in the Namaqualand, because I was seeing all those sister species that I was showing you just now, well, just a bunch of them. And you know, there is Pelaogonium cericifolium, which lacked a sister species belonging to the white Pollination Guild. So you see, Pelaogonium cericifolium is purple Pollination Guild, long tubes. So it's pollinated by long tongue flies. It's got those, you know, everything makes it part of the purple Pollination Guild. So that was very clear, but I thought maybe somewhere there's a white version of it with a late flowering time, but nothing had been found like that. But after just 2 months, actually, in 2015, my first year in Namaqualand, I did find it, and it was just a crazy surprise because I couldn't believe it. I mean, there was no way I could just expect that. I just thought that would be funny if there was a white late flowering version of cericifolium, and there is one. And what's crazy is that it, to me, I mean, it's not been described, and I think if we can give it a conservation priority status, it's that it's endangered, because it's only found on 6 granite downs in the Kamisberg and nowhere else, and it's actually suffering a lot from overgrazing and trampling by big animals, big cows and sheep. So, but it is there, white flowers, white yellowish flowers, late flowering syndrome. So yeah, that was a great surprise to me, and a very funny story, given all the observations that I've shown before. And that's it. So thank you for your attention. And I can read the questions now.
Thank you very much, Florent, for this absolutely fascinating presentation. I'm sure everybody learned an awful lot from you, and you're just such a wealth. You've got such a wealth of knowledge. It's astounding. We wish you all the best in your future endeavors. We understand that you'll be making a documentary in South Africa next year. So I'm sure that I'm sharing everybody's opinion when I say that we can't wait to see you back in your natural habitat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.